And now the air. The topic today is, what does the history of the Alaskan mission have to tell us, teach us, inform us about mission anywhere? And so we have to start at the beginning of our story. I didn't exactly do that. It wasn't a cohesive historical chronological story the last time. We talked about the soil into which the seed of the gospel was planted in the first lecture. The Native Alaskan cultural and spiritual heritage before the coming of the gospel, and how it was ready to receive the gospel in a unique way. As the gospel was incarnate, one can say, in the culture of Palestine or the Middle East or Egypt or Ethiopia. And as the gospel has been incarnate in Greece and in the Balkans and in the Slavic countries of Eastern Europe and across Siberia. And finally, beginning in 1742 in Alaska. Vitus Bering, a Danish man who was a citizen of the Russian Empire, and by the way, Orthodox, was the captain of a second voyage to the Russian Far East, what is now the Bering Sea region, in 1741, 1742. And he and Alexei Chirikov, who captained the second boat, made landfall in Alaska, returned to Russia. Actually, Bering died on the return voyage, but Chirikov survived in his boat, and came back with sea otter pelts from the Aleutian Islands. And we mentioned in the first talk that these sea otter pelts were the most prized of all furs in China. It wasn't for Russia that these Russian trappers and traders were going to Alaska. It was to trade the pelts for silk and tea and other Chinese trade goods. This was the whole focus of the fur trade. And Bering and his survivors, coming back to Russia with these sea otter pelts, set off a fur rush similar to what we would have as a gold rush in American history. Americans ran after gold, Russians ran after fur. And the fur rush began when the survivors of the Bering-Chirikov exploration returned with dozens of sea otter pelts. Now, the sea otters live mostly at sea. That's why they're called sea otters rather than land otters. That's a different species. And the sea otters have more fur per square inch than any other animal. It's waterproof and warm at the same time, and extremely soft, softer than mink. So these three factors, its softness, it's a luxurious fur, its waterproof nature, the density of the fur, and then, of course, the warmth, made it the most prized of all furs in the Orient. But they live at sea. So the promyshleniki, as we call these entrepreneurs, these commercialmen, these Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Jeremiah Johnson types we mentioned last time, they got into boats that they made by themselves about as long as from the lectern here to the wall. 30, 40 feet long they made these boats. That's as big as they could make them. And they piled them with trade goods, buckets and blankets and beads, anything they thought the people of the Aleutian Islands might want, and they set sail for Alaska. It was an adventure. The histories of Alaska, written in San Francisco in English 150 years later, say these guys were greedy. And they would have you believe that this was a kind of Rambo-esque invasion of the Aleutian Islands, where the promyshleniki with their 6 guns blazing, came in there, and it was a big holdup, basically. For the next 50 years, there was raiding and pillaging and exploitation and enslavement. It was a horrible, lawless time, not in the Wild West, but in the Russian Wild East. And these promyshleniki were military people, bandits of sorts, who came in and robbed the people of their furs. Well, the Aleuts weren't sitting around with lots of sea otter pelts piled up in their houses. The sea otters were there, but they weren't of particular value to the Unangan, the people of the Aleutian Islands. But they became very valuable when the traders came with their trade goods and wanted to bargain for them. Now, first of all, these guys came in small groups, 6, 8, 10 men in one of these rub-a-dub-dub tubs. And they just pooled their resources to buy enough of the blankets and the metal tools, the knives and such, to make it worthwhile for the Unangan hunters to go hunting for sea otters and bring the sea otter pelts in. So this was trade. At first, of course, people were suspicious of them when they saw what nice blankets they had, what nice metal tools they had, what beautiful beads they brought. There was an immediate demand, as there would be in any culture. By the way, the native peoples from Kamchatka and the Aleutian Islands had been trading with each other for centuries. So having some other guys coming from Siberia, a third of whom were also Kamchadal, we shouldn't envision this as white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Russians from Moscow coming to Alaska. These were people, many of whom were of mixed ancestry, Slavic and Asian Siberian native. A third of them were Kamchatal natives themselves. So this wasn't a big racial clash. And these guys came, this is the early 1700s. You know what the state of firearms was in those days. Anyone who's seen a movie about the American Revolution would know how long it took to reload in that time. And you had to keep your powder dry in an area where the climate is not only wet, but very windy. The rain in the Aleutian Islands comes at you horizontally rather than vertically. So these guys come into this kind of climate, 8 or 10 people against hundreds of Unangan. It's not a conquista. It's not Cortez or Pizarro coming to conquer a people and then stay. These are visiting salesmen. It's the Fuller Brush Man. It's the Avon lady. Now, the Avon lady might have a pistol, but not enough to subdue the entire community and enslave it, as later histories written in English in San Francisco would have you believe. Here's where the oral tradition of the Unangan and the published texts in English are in complete contrast. What happens instead in this first 50 years of contact with Siberian people and Native Alaskans is that these guys come with their trade goods and they make some money and they go home with furs and they cash them in and they're rich temporarily. 10 men with 100 pelts, they could probably retire on what the income of that would represent. But they never retired. First of all, they gave a lot of it away. Orphanage schools and churches got a good deal of the income from these voyages. They gave icons to the local church in glory to God and thanksgiving for their safe return and survival. And then whatever money was left, they partied. It was drinks on the house in the local tavern. We're talking Russian frontiersmen here, guys. They squandered the rest, basically, and within a year they were broke, and they re-upped for another trip to the Aleutian Islands. This was their lifestyle. They did it for the adventure of it all. We still have Alaskans like that, coming up to the last frontier for a year, for 2, sometimes for 30, and making it their way of life. They do it for the adventure, and what comes across in what literature we have from them is a love of the land and the people. They liked going back. In fact, little by little, they started to stay. You can imagine this happening. This is your 3rd trip to this particular village. All the men, by the way, are out hunting in their kayaks at sea. So the Promyshleniki, the Siberians, are home with all the cute Aleut girls. Little by little, you know who gets the girl, the guy with all the beads. And the Promyshlenik says to his colleagues, you guys go home, I'm staying. Now, most of us probably would not prefer to remain in the Aleutian Islands. The climate is horrible. By our standards, if you come from Santa Barbara, California in particular, you wouldn't consider moving to Adak. But if you were born in Irkutsk, where it's 40 below half the year, Unalaska is the closest to Tahiti you're ever going to get. You have to come at it from their perspective. These islands were paradisic from their point of view, warm by comparison to their homeland. And so little by little, and this is the opening of Orthodox mission in North America, these Promyshleniki, 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 and soon 10 by 10, and eventually by the hundreds, remained in the Aleutian Islands, moved in with their Unangan sweethearts, baptized their children, and built the first chapels. When Father Macari, the Hierom monk assigned to the Aleutian Islands in 1794, came to the Aleutian Islands, he discovered he had no one to baptize. Because all the people there had been baptized by their Siberian ancestors. They had no chapels to build. The chapels were already built. They didn't have lavish iconostasi. They didn't have the vestments ready or the chalice for the first liturgy. But there were prayer chapels, and the entire population had been baptized before the clergy showed up. What does that tell us, first of all, about Orthodox mission? That mission is not the job of the clergy. It is not, I repeat, the job of the clergy. The priest has his pastoral ministry within his parish. It's a tension with which I deal on a daily basis. Priests are assigned to a parish. They have to tend to the pastoral needs of their flock. The priest's job is an inside one. It's very hard for the priest to at the same time be the man on the edge, so to speak, of the community, dealing with those outside the community at the same time. I believe that a priest must, but every bishop I've had has disagreed. They say, Father, take care of your flock. What are you doing at the university? Talking to not a single Orthodox there. And I remind them, mission is to those who are on the outside. But the priest has a lot of responsibility to those who are already Orthodox, who are his flock on the inside. So where does the outreach occur? It cannot be left. It's too important to be left to the priest. Mission is a lay responsibility. And I would go so far as to say mission is primarily a lay responsibility. And the first thing we can learn from the history of the church in Alaska is exactly that. The laymen evangelized. The laity baptized. They were there 50 years before the first priests showed up. And when the clergy came, they had no one left to baptize. The elementary first teachings of the church, the life of Jesus Christ was well known. St. Innocent comes in 1824 and he says, everyone in my area is baptized, but they don't have any catechisms. They don't have the scriptures. I have to deepen their faith. I have to enrich their faith. I have to educate them more in their faith. But the faith itself, they already have. The churches have been built. The baptisms have occurred. Now it's for me to extend that. But the foundations are laid by lay evangelism. Priests have too many pastoral responsibilities in their parishes. Don't think that every priest wouldn't like to be a Constantine Nasser or a Father Veronis. They would. But sometimes there are so many pastoral issues and problems in their parish to attend to, they do not have the time or the energy, and possibly the talent and the training as well, to do the necessary outreach. It's a lay responsibility. And the first thing we can learn from the Alaskan mission is that's exactly how the foundations of Orthodoxy in North America were laid, by laity. Many of them illiterate laity, but remember my grandmother. And some of you can remember yours. And there's where the true faith, the spirituality. I don't disagree that you can't learn things from books. I'm a PhD. I've read lots of books. But the bottom line is, the books come alive when you meet someone who really believes it and lives it. And that's the witness that every lay person is responsible for. So I'm Orthodox, but I don't know what that is. I'm Orthodox, that means I wear a 3-barred cross and I eat certain ethnic foods. No, that's not evangelism. But I'm Orthodox and I pray. I'm Orthodox and I fast. I'm Orthodox and I receive the sacraments. I'm Orthodox and I love my neighbor. Where are the fruits of this creed? Where are the fruits of this doctrine? And that's what happened in these first 50 years. These guys could not have come in Rambo style, pistols blazing, and massacred people the way Bancroft wrote in San Francisco in the 1880s and converted anybody to anything. They themselves would have been massacred because they were outnumbered 200 to 1. With the few firearms they had, they would have been pincushions. You know what I mean? Lots of arrows stuck in them long before they could have successfully conquered the Unangan. But that didn't happen. They converted them to Orthodoxy, and this is the most Orthodox region in North America to this day. There simply aren't any other kinds of Christians in the Aleutian Islands. Everybody's Orthodox. They've been Orthodox for 200 years, and we have had all kinds of efforts to convert them, even with federal government support, to give them an American religion. As late as the 1970s, by the way, 1968, the federal government financed Assembly of God missionaries to the Pribilof Islands, as they put it, for the religious diversification of the Aleut. Success rate, 0. But why 0? Because the foundations were laid by their own ancestors, who taught them the faith and to which those people are fervently devoted to this day, 2.5 centuries later. In 1794, the priests belatedly showed up. They were recruited from Bavalam Monastery, as you know, near Russian Finland on Lake Ladoga. And they walked most of the way to Alaska. It was not an easy trip for these missionaries. And they had been promised by the founder of the Russian-American company, Gregory Shelikov, who arrived in 1784, this time with cannons and guns. Shelikov and his company had the idea that why bother to trade with these people, these barbarians? Let's go in there and get serious. Let's send ships to Alaska, armed ships, and let's load the shiploads of furs to send back to China. Let's get serious about exploiting the natural resources of this territory. Let's conquer these people and force them to do our will. Why bother with the buckets and the beads and the blankets? Bring bullets this time. And that was the philosophy in 1784 when the Russian-American company was founded. It was called the Golikov-Shelikov company after its two main investors. And they came deliberately not to the Aleutian Islands, which is the area off my map, out this way, 1,000 miles. But they came here to Kodiak Island, and they landed at Three Saints Bay. They had stopped here at Unalaska in the Aleutian chain to ransom a Kodiak POW. They knew that the people on Kodiak, this green line represents the boundary, and the people of the Aleutian chain were traditional enemies. And they knew that both sides had slaves, which were really prisoners of war from the other side. So Shelikov landed at Unalaska and ransomed such a POW, one who spoke the Kodiak language, and said, "You're coming home with me, buddy." And this man was the first Judas of his people. He was sent to the leaders of his own tribe with a message that Shelikov had come in peace and they should just trade and basically surrender. And instead, the Sugpiaq people of Kodiak Island withdrew to a fortified site on this island, Sitkalillik Island nearby, and did their best to defend themselves against these Siberians. Gashbak, the guy who was the POW, led them through a kind of back door into their fortress. And there was a massacre in which about 200 people were killed. And it was the subjugation of Kodiak Island. Shelikov then went back to Russia to ask the Empress, Catherine the Great, for a monopoly on all the trade, not only in Alaska, but he wanted Japan, Korea, and the Philippines besides. Shelikov was something of a rogue, but he exaggerated his accomplishments so much and boasted so brazenly about what he had done. I find him quite likable because he's sort of like one of those boastful Texans of stereotypes where he just makes you laugh out loud. He makes such preposterous claims about his own sacrifices and accomplishments. Catherine wasn't listening. She was reading laissez-faire economics. She said, "Grisha, please go back and tend to your company." She pinned a medal on his chest and dismissed him. A few weeks later, one of her own naval squadrons who had visited Kodiak Island reported to her in St. Petersburg about the massacres, which of course Gregory Shelikov never mentioned. And she says it's lucky he got out of town. He'd be arrested and be thrown in jail if I'd known these things earlier. In any case, Shelikov never makes it back to Kodiak. He only made the one conquering visit in 1784, but he didn't give up. He tried to pull every possible political string he could to get the Empress to change her mind. And the one trump card he thought he could play was the church card. He spoke to the abbot, the igumen of Valam Monastery, and said, "I need clergy. The people, these thousands," he said 50,000 people. There weren't more than 10,000 people on the island. But these 50,000 new conquered citizens are thirsting for the gospel, Father. And if you could only recruit a priest for me, we can convert them and baptize them all. Well, the abbot listened and made this proposal to his monastic community, and 8 men from Valam and Konavitsa nearby monasteries volunteered to go to Alaska. As I said, they walked across Siberia for more than a year. There was a big send-off in St. Petersburg, but after that, it was a long journey. The longest missionary journey in Orthodox history. St. Herman, St. Juvenali, and the other monks undertook, beginning in December of 1793 and arriving in Kodiak September 24th, 1794. This is the date of the bicentennial of Orthodoxy in America. Notice that we only date the beginning of the church with the coming of the clergy. But actually, Orthodoxy was already there and had been for decades prior to their arrival. Not on Kodiak Island, but in the Aleutians. Now, Shelikov had also said not only were these people thirsting for the gospel, but they had already built a church in joyful anticipation of the arrival of the first priest. They were expecting 1 priest. Well, 3 priests and 5 other monks showed up. And the company manager, Alexander Baranov, was busy exploiting and oppressing and basically annihilating the population of Kodiak Island. He was sending men off by the hundreds to the Alaskan mainland, to the Pribilof Islands. He sent some to the Kuril Islands just north of Japan. He impressed others into involuntary servitude and sent them to Yakutat, which is about here, Southeast Alaska, Sitka. They manned eventually Fort Ross, just north of San Francisco, here in California. They ran a trading post in the Hawaiian Islands on Kauai. If you add up the number of men drafted into company service, really at gunpoint, by Baranov and his henchmen, it comes to practically the entire male adult population of Kodiak Island, leaving the women and children at home with no one to provide for them. So when the missionaries arrived from Finland, expecting this beautiful, idyllic Russian community where everyone was living in harmony and where everyone was thirsting for the gospel, they found instead real oppression and exploitation, their own countrymen taking advantage of and oppressing the native people. They didn't just go into culture shock, they got very angry. In 1795, Archimandrit Yosef, the head of the mission, wrote a long letter naively to Shelikov himself, saying, "Oddly, nothing the way you described it is true. It must be your manager who is violating your orders." Of course, Shelikov knew exactly what Baranov was up to. And he was in no way going to interfere in Baranov's operation. They were making money. So the monks began protesting the oppression of their countrymen and taking the side of the native people. They wound up under house arrest for over a year. There were 3 assassination attempts on the life of St. Herman. His causes would have you think that he was glorified because of his holy and prayerful life, which is certainly true, but it's only half the story. The reason the Aleut people venerated him was not only for his personal holiness, but for his moral courage. He took their side at great personal risk. He petitioned constantly for 30 years for redress of the wrongs being inflicted on them by his own countrymen who tried to kill him in return. It's no accident that St. Herman left Kodiak. We don't know exactly when, but he relocated to Spruce Island, a remote place 4 miles offshore where they would have a harder time getting at him. From there he wrote his protests. It was from there he conducted his prayerful life in his hermitage. And it was from there that he defended the Aleut people against their oppressors. The head of the mission, Father Yosef, went back to Russia to complain directly to the governor. And he was ordained Bishop of Kodiak, the only man ever so titled, in order to go back with the political as well as religious and moral power to put the Alaskan house in order. But the ship bearing him back to Alaska sank off the Aleutian chain, and Baranov's rule continued for another 20 years. It's during this time, of course, that the other monks sort of tried to get out of harm's way, those that survived. Father Makari, who was the missionary to the Aleutian Islands I mentioned earlier, also had gone back to Russia to report to the authorities on these abuses and went down with the same ship. Father Juvenali traveled along Cook Inlet, wintered in the area just north of Anchorage, and then crossed the Alaska Peninsula on his way to the Seward Peninsula, the part of Alaska that's closest to Russia. You see, there were Russian promushleniki sailing around the Chukotka Peninsula in 1648. So there were rumors down here in Kodiak that there were Russian settlements here on the Seward Peninsula. And Father Juvenali was trying to make a connection between the two. Sailing along the coast here, he was killed by an Eskimo hunting party at the mouth of the Kuskokwim River. His disappearance has been the longest-standing murder mystery in the history of Alaska. I think about 10 years I cracked the case. The written tradition, completely fabricated by Ivan Petrov in San Francisco, says that he died at the shores of Lake Iliamna here, and he was killed because he was removing children from their villages to take them back to a school in Kodiak. There was no school in Kodiak, and he was forbidden to remove children from their homes. The monks said it's a bad idea to take children away from their parents, even in the name of schooling, and it shouldn't be done. So he certainly wasn't doing that. I was priest in this region, the area under my hand. When I was first ordained, I had 17 villages to visit. And I went to those villages and said, "What's your story about the first priest?" And they said, "He went that away." I thought, well, yeah, sure, they're not going to fess up to the fact that their ancestors bumped off the first missionary, right? But then I heard a story along the Kuskokwim that said the first priest that came to our region was killed at the mouth of the river. That couldn't be true, I thought to myself, not wanting to contradict the elder. But I knew that the first priest to come to this region was Father Yakov Netzvetov, who was a missionary on the Yukon, and in his old age retired and died down here in Sitka. So this is somehow a garbled message, I decided. The elder doesn't know what he's talking about here, and these guys are involved in a cover-up. And then I realized, wait a minute. Maybe they know what they're talking about. Maybe Father Juvenali really did go that way. And maybe he really was killed at the mouth of the Kuskokwim River, because the written accounts, we know, are pure fabrication. This whole chapter on the death of Father Juvenali was concocted by the translator, and the forged diary of Saint Juvenali is in the Bancroft Library, but it only exists suspiciously in English. The Russian original has never been located. We have this priest celebrating feast days that don't exist on our calendar and sailing on boats that are named for saints that are never paired together. Ships, in fact, that never existed. But nobody bothered. You can see, if you're an Orthodox Christian, that the diary of Saint Juvenali a la Bancroft is a complete hoax. But if you're not Orthodox and you don't know anything about feast days and saints and names of Russian voyages and ships and so forth, you wouldn't spot it. So American historians, not knowing enough about Orthodoxy, have made the error of accepting the diary in the Bancroft Library as authentic. But once I saw the diary and realized that was bogus, and once I realized that my parishioners were probably not lying to me at Iliam the Lake, I went back to the informant, who turns out to be now my father-in-law, and asked him, tell me, Grandpa, the story of how the first priest was killed at the mouth of the Kuskokwim River. And he said, well, he was coming along the shore, as I was told as a boy by an elder, in a small boat, not a kayak, a small boat, Anyachoch, little boat. And he was warned not to land by the shaman, the medicine man, and the hunting party with him. But he didn't pay any attention to these warnings. He kept approaching anyway. And the hunting party, being armed with bows and arrows, killed him in a hail of arrows. My father-in-law calls his man accompanying him, his accomplice, like his nakista, his reader. Now, Juvenali left Kodiak alone. So he must have picked up this man, a native Alaskan, as a guide somewhere along his travels, probably here in the Athabascan region north of Anchorage, who showed him the way across the mountains, down the river, and out to the Bering Sea. This man accompanying him jumped overboard and tried to swim away. Eskimos don't swim. The water's either frozen or too cold all of the year. And they were impressed with this man's swimming ability. And they had to get into their kayaks and chase him. They said it was like a seal hunt. And they eventually killed this nakista, this reader. Now, there's more to the story, but that's the essence of it. Except that the shaman took from Father Juvenali's body his pectoral cross, his brass cross, and tried to do some kind of magic, which at that point didn't work. And he took this cross off and gave it to someone else and said, I don't know what power there is in this, but it's a power I can't deal with. Whoever else comes with such a thing, we better not mess around. Well, the next missionary to come to that village was a Moravian missionary from Pennsylvania, from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And he says the people accepted him rather readily. This is 100 years later. And he records in his diary in the 1890s that he's not the first missionary to visit this site, that apparently there was a Greek priest here sometime earlier. A priest of the Russo-Greco Church, I think he calls it. They never dare call it Orthodox, you see. And he was killed in a hail of arrows. And his accomplice tried to swim away like a seal, and they had to go after him. It's the same story, word for word, as my father-in-law told me. But now it's in writing, so we can believe it. Now, what leaves me still puzzled about Father Juvenali's martyrdom is, why did they do it? Why, as soon as they saw him, were they so afraid that they felt they had to kill him to protect themselves? Well, I found out by looking through a catalog of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., that shamans on the Alaskan coast, imitating shamans on the Siberian coastline, carved for themselves ivory chains, because the shamans on the Siberian side wore metal chains as a sign of their rank and power as shamans. So Saint Juvenali was simply mistaken as a rival shaman coming into Eskimo territory, and was killed as the only way you can defend yourself against the magic or the spiritual powers of some intruder. So this all somehow eventually, it also shows that there was trade across the Bering Straits long before Slavic people got involved, because the shamans here knew about the shamans over there.